Somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, on a clear November morning in 2004, a United States Navy fighter pilot came face to face with something that should not exist. Something that moved without wings, without exhaust, without any visible means of propulsion. Something that dropped from 80,000 feet to just above the ocean's surface in less than a second. Something that hovered, tilted, and then vanished at speeds that no known aircraft, American, Russian, Chinese, or otherwise, could ever achieve. Commander David Fravor, a highly decorated Navy pilot with over 16 years of flying experience, looked out of his F/A-18 Super Hornet cockpit and saw a white, oval-shaped object about 40 feet long, with no wings, no tail, no engine signature, dancing above a churning patch of ocean like it was toying with the laws of physics. He radioed back to the USS Nimitz. He said, and these are his exact words, "It's a white Tic-Tac." And in that moment, without knowing it, Commander Fravor ignited one of the greatest military mysteries of the 21st century. A mystery that the United States Navy would eventually acknowledge. A mystery that the United States Air Force would spend years pretending it never heard of. And that difference, that silence, is the story we are telling today. Welcome. If you are someone who believes that the sky holds secrets far beyond what our governments are willing to admit, then you are in exactly the right place. Today we are going to go deep, deeper than the headlines, deeper than the Pentagon press releases, deeper than the social media clips of blurry footage. We are going to explore one of the most meticulously documented, most credible, most strategically important UFO encounters in recorded military history. And we are going to ask a question that military historians, aerospace analysts, intelligence officials, and ordinary citizens have been struggling to answer ever since the story broke. Why did the Navy talk? And why did the Air Force stay completely, utterly, and almost suspiciously silent? This is not a fringe topic. This is not about conspiracy theories or tinfoil hats. The people involved in the Tic-Tac encounter were among the most rigorously trained, most psychologically evaluated, most professionally accomplished aviators on the planet. These were men and women who had dedicated their entire lives to understanding the sky. Men and women who had flown through combat zones, who had landed supersonic jets on moving aircraft carriers at night, who had done things most human beings cannot even imagine. And they saw something they could not explain, and they reported it. And what happened after they reported it tells us more about the politics of military secrecy in America than almost any other story you will ever find. So let us go back. Let us go all the way back to November 2004, off the coast of Southern California, in international waters about 100 miles southwest of San Diego. The USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group, one of the most powerful naval battle formations on Earth, was in the middle of routine training operations. The strike group included the USS Nimitz itself, one of America's nuclear-powered supercarriers, as well as the USS Princeton, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser equipped with some of the most advanced radar systems in the American arsenal. And it was the USS Princeton's radar operators who first noticed something was wrong with the sky. For several days before the encounter, multiple days, not just once, not just a glitch, the Princeton's spy, one radar had been tracking objects behaving in ways that violated every known principle of aerodynamics. Objects that appeared at extremely high altitudes. Objects that descended rapidly, holding position near the ocean's surface, then disappeared. Objects that moved in ways that suggested no ballistic trajectory, no aerodynamic lift, no jet propulsion. The radar operators initially assumed the system was malfunctioning. They ran diagnostics. They recalibrated the equipment. They reported the anomalies up the chain of command. And they kept watching. Senior Chief Operations Specialist Kevin Day was one of the radar operators aboard the Princeton during those critical days. He has spoken publicly about what he tracked. He described watching objects that appeared to travel at speeds exceeding 5,000 miles per hour, roughly 6.5 times the speed of sound, while making instantaneous directional changes that would have crushed any human pilot into unconsciousness and likely death from the G-forces alone. He described objects that would fall from 80,000 feet in altitude to around 20,000 feet in mere seconds, then hover. Just hover, as if physics was a suggestion rather than a law. Day said he watched these objects for days before the November 10th engagement. Days. He reported it. He flagged it. He told his superiors. And what came back down the chain of command was essentially an instruction to keep watching. Now, before we get to the morning of November 14th, 2004, the day Commander Fravor had his direct visual encounter, we need to understand something about who these people were. Because one of the most important things about the Tic-Tac case is not just the technology involved, it is the caliber and credibility of the witnesses. In most UFO reports throughout history, the eyewitnesses are private citizens, farmers, truck drivers, suburban homeowners who saw something strange in the sky one night. And while those people deserve to be heard and taken seriously, there is an obvious challenge when it comes to assessing their reports objectively. They are not trained observers. They may not understand what military or commercial aircraft look like at various altitudes and angles. They may misidentify conventional phenomena. None of that is a criticism. It is simply an acknowledgement of the challenge. But Commander David Fravor was not a suburban homeowner. He was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy. He had completed Top Gun, formerly known as the Navy Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program, the most demanding aerial combat training program on the planet. He had logged over 3,000 flight hours in high-performance fighter jets. He had served in combat. He knew exactly what conventional aircraft looked like. He knew what balloons looked like. He knew what weather phenomena looked like. He knew what drones looked like. He knew what missiles looked like. He had seen virtually every type of aerial vehicle the United States and its adversaries operated. And he had never seen anything like what he saw on November 14th, 2004. That morning, Fravor was leading a flight of 4 F/A-18 Super Hornets on a standard training mission. His wingman was Lieutenant Commander Jim Slate. 2 additional aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich and her wingman, were flying in a separate element. The Princeton made radio contact with Fravor's flight and directed them to a location where the anomalous objects had been tracked. The radar operators told Fravor there were multiple contacts, plural, and that they had been present intermittently for several days. They asked if Fravor's team could go take a visual look. Fravor agreed. When Fravor and his team arrived at the designated area, they saw something unusual at the ocean surface below them. The water was disturbed in a roughly 100-foot diameter circle, churning and frothing white, as if something large was moving just beneath the surface, or had recently been there. And hovering directly above that churning water, at roughly 20,000 feet altitude, was the Tic-Tac. White, smooth, oblong, about 40 feet in length. No wings. No tail, no visible propulsion system, no heat signature from jet exhaust, no rotor blades, no markings of any kind, just a white, featureless craft moving in a pattern that Fravor described as erratic, bouncing around, left, right, up, down, but with a kind of purposeful quality, as if it was aware of its environment. Fravor made a decision. He decided to try to intercept it. He put his Super Hornet into a descending spiral, trying to cut off the object's path and get closer to it. And what happened next is the thing that changed everything. As Fravor descended toward the Tic-Tac, the object responded. It began to mirror his movements. It moved toward him as he moved toward it, matching his direction, then reversing. It appeared to be aware of him. It appeared to be reacting to him. And then, when Fravor had descended about half the distance between his original altitude and the object, the Tic-Tac did something that, even today, more than 2 decades later, no aerospace engineer has been able to fully explain. It accelerated away, not in any of the conventional directions, not to the left or right or upward. It simply went. In an instant, gone. Moving faster than Fravre's eyes could follow, faster than the instruments could track. And it vanished. Fravre climbed back up. He contacted the Princeton. He told them the object was gone. And the Princeton radar operators, monitoring with their advanced systems from 60 miles away, said it went to our CAP point, meaning the Tic-Tac had, in an instant, traveled approximately 60 miles to a pre-designated combat air patrol point that Fravre's flight had been using earlier that day, a point that the Princeton's crew had been using as an internal reference, a classified reference point for that day's operations. Let that sink in, because it is one of the most disturbing details in the entire story, and it receives nowhere near enough attention. The object went directly to a classified tactical coordinate. Not approximately, not in the general direction, directly to. Either that is the most extraordinary coincidence in military history, or the object somehow had access to information about the strike group's operational plan. And neither of those explanations is comfortable. After Fravre returned to the Nimitz, a second flight of F divided by a -18S was launched to investigate. This time the aircraft were equipped with the ASQ 228 Advanced Targeting Forward-Looking Infrared Pod, known as FLIR. And the infrared footage that pod captured is what the world eventually came to know as the Tic-Tac video, or FLIR-1 video, one of 3 Naughty classified Navy UAP videos, along with Gimbal and Go Fast. The FLIR-1 footage shows the Tic-Tac being tracked by the infrared system. It shows the object with no heat signature from conventional propulsion. It shows the object moving in a way that forces the targeting system to struggle to keep it centered. And at the end of the footage, the object accelerates away and the pilots are heard saying, on the recorded audio, words to the effect of "there it goes" and expressions of genuine disbelief. This video, along with the testimonies of Fravre, Dietrich, Slate, and multiple radar operators, constitutes one of the most robust documented UFO encounters in the history of military aviation. Multiple witnesses, multiple sensor systems, multiple days of prior radar tracking. A visual encounter from trained aviators at close range, infrared footage, and physical evidence in the form of the disturbed water at the ocean surface. The Navy had an extraordinary case on its hands, and the question of what they did with it, and crucially what the Air Force did with it, is where this story becomes truly remarkable. In the days after the encounter, something happened that the crew of the Nimitz has spoken about publicly, reluctantly, and with clear discomfort. People came aboard the ship. People who did not identify themselves by name or unit. People in plain clothes who began collecting data. According to multiple crew members, hard drives were removed from the ship's systems. Video recordings were taken. Data logs were confiscated. Petty Officer First Class Kevin Thomas and other crew members have described being approached by individuals who collected whatever recorded data related to the encounter existed, and who told crew members in no uncertain terms to not discuss what they had seen. This was not a formal classified briefing with documentation and signatures. This was an informal, undocumented sweep. The data disappeared, and for 13 years, officially, nothing had happened. Now let us pause here and talk about the United States Air Force, because this is the heart of what makes this story so historically and institutionally fascinating. If you know American military history, you know that the Air Force has historically been the primary keeper of the UFO file in this country. From Project Sign in 1948, to Project Grudge in 1949, to Project Blue Book, which ran from 1952 to 1969, the Air Force was the official investigator of unidentified aerial phenomena for over 2 decades. They were the ones who took the reports, assessed the reports, and, critics would say, systematically minimized and debunked the reports. In 1969, when Blue Book was officially closed, the Air Force issued a formal conclusion stating that there was no evidence that any UFO represented extraterrestrial technology, and that no UFO had ever posed a threat to national security. Case closed. Filed. Forgotten. Officially. And for the next 35 years, whenever the topic of UFOs came up in serious policy discussions, the Air Force was essentially the institutional gatekeeper. They were the ones who had the authority, the history, and the bureaucratic weight to define the American government's official position on the subject. If you wanted to know what the United States government thought about unidentified aerial phenomena, you looked to the Air Force. So when the Tic-Tac encounter happened in November 2004, the natural question is, where was the Air Force? The USS Nimitz Strike Group was operating in American territorial defense zones. The objects tracked by the Princeton's radar were violating controlled airspace. The objects exhibited flight characteristics that represented a potential national security concern of the highest order. If any branch of the American military had both the mandate and the institutional history to investigate this, it was the Air Force. So what did they say? Nothing. What investigation did they launch? None that anyone knows of. What official response did they issue? Silence. This is not a small detail. This is not a bureaucratic footnote. The Air Force's silence in the face of what is objectively one of the most compelling military UFO encounters ever documented raises questions that have never been adequately answered. And when you set that silence against the Navy's eventual decision to not only acknowledge the encounter, but to formally change its UAP reporting protocols in 2019, the contrast becomes even more striking. Why did the Navy talk? Why did the Air Force stay silent? These are the two questions at the absolute core of this story. And to answer them properly, we need to understand several things about institutional culture, historical precedent, political calculation, and the very different ways in which these two military branches have historically related to the phenomenon of unidentified aerial phenomena. Let us start with the Navy's decision to eventually come forward. In 2017, the New York Times published its landmark investigation into the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ADIP, a secret government program that had investigated UAP from 2007 to 2012 with approximately $22 million in funding. The article was written by journalists Helene Cooper, Ralph Blumenthal, and Leslie Kean, and it was accompanied by the release of the FLIR 1 video, the Tic-Tac footage. Commander Fravor spoke on record. The story was enormous. It dominated news cycles. It generated bipartisan congressional interest. And it represented something that had almost never happened before in the history of American government. A serious, credible, documented look at military UAP encounters that could not be easily dismissed. What is important to understand is that this revelation did not happen accidentally. The Times investigation was, in significant part, enabled by people inside the military and intelligence establishment who wanted the story told. Tom DeLonge, the former Blink-182 musician turned UAP advocate, had spent years cultivating relationships with senior military and intelligence officials. A fact that sounds absurd until you learn that it is documented in detail through emails released as part of the John Podesta email hack during the 2016 election cycle. DeLonge was in contact with retired generals, former deputy assistant secretaries of defense, and senior intelligence officials, all of whom were, with varying degrees of openness, encouraging the public disclosure of information about UAP. And several of these individuals had Navy backgrounds, not Air Force backgrounds. Navy. Luis Elizondo, the intelligence official who is most publicly associated with ADIP and who became one of the most prominent voices for UAP transparency, had a career that intersected with multiple agencies and services. When he left the Pentagon in 2017, he immediately began working with DeLonge's organization, to the Stars Academy of Arts and Science, alongside former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence Christopher Mellon, again, a figure with Navy and intelligence community connections. The team pushing for transparency was not Air Force. It was Navy adjacent, intelligence community adjacent, and notably absent of active Air Force institutional support. Why does this matter? Because it suggests that the decision to disclose, partial, careful, calculated disclosure, was at least partially a Navy institutional decision, or at minimum was enabled by people with Navy and intelligence backgrounds who had reasons to want certain information in the public domain. The Navy, unlike the Air Force, had not spent 20 years running a publicly known UFO investigation program that ended in institutional embarrassment. The Air Force's Blue Book program had been widely criticized as a debunking exercise rather than a genuine scientific investigation. The Condon Committee report that accompanied Blue Book's closure in 1969 was itself a controversy. Physicist James McDonald and others accused it of predetermined conclusions and shoddy methodology. The Air Force's institutional relationship with the UAP topic was, and remains, defined by that legacy of appearing to cover up and minimize. The Navy, by contrast, had no such legacy. The Navy had not been the designated UAP investigator. The Navy had not spent 20 years accumulating a public record of minimization and denial. The Navy was, in a sense, institutionally clean on the topic. And that gave the Navy something the Air Force did not have: the ability to acknowledge an extraordinary encounter without immediately triggering associations with decades of perceived stonewalling. When the Navy said, in 2019, that it was formalizing new procedures for reporting unidentified aerial phenomena, procedures that explicitly acknowledged that UAP encounters were real, documented, and worthy of systematic investigation, it could do so without the institutional weight of Blue Book hanging around its neck. But there is more to it than just institutional reputation. There is also the question of operational threat. The Navy's encounters with UAP have been overwhelmingly reported in the context of naval aviation, F/A, 18 pilots, carrier-based aircraft, maritime patrol operations. And unlike the Air Force, which operates primarily from fixed land bases with multiple layers of ground-based air defense infrastructure, the Navy's aircraft carriers are essentially floating sovereign territories in open ocean, extraordinarily powerful, but also, in certain respects, extraordinarily exposed. A carrier strike group in the Western Pacific or the Persian Gulf does not have the same redundant ground-based radar coverage and air defense support that an Air Force base in the continental United States enjoys. The Navy's threat calculus is different. And if something is operating in close proximity to carrier strike groups, repeatedly, consistently, with apparent awareness of the group's operational parameters, that is a readiness concern that the Navy's leadership genuinely needs to understand and address, regardless of what the object ultimately turns out to be. Senior Chief Kevin Day has spoken about this directly. He has said that part of what disturbed him about the objects he tracked on the Princeton's radar was not just their extraordinary flight characteristics. It was the fact that they appeared to be loitering in the area where the Nimitz's aircraft were operating. They were in the training space. They were, from an operational perspective, a hazard and a potential threat. And the Navy, unlike the Air Force in this context, had an immediate operational reason to take the reports seriously, to document them properly, and eventually to build formal reporting structures around them. There is also the matter of what happened between 2004 and 2019 and the extraordinary effort that a small group of people had to make to bring the Tic-Tac story into the public consciousness. Commander Fravor himself has spoken about the lack of any formal follow-up investigation after the encounter. He was not interviewed by intelligence officials. He was not asked to file a detailed report with the Defense Intelligence Agency. Nobody from the Air Force showed up to debrief him. Nobody from any official UFO investigation body, because by 2004, no such body officially existed, contacted him. He went back to his duties as if the encounter had been, from an institutional standpoint, simply a non-event. The Navy had no mechanism, in 2004, for formally escalating an extraordinary UAP report. The report went up the chain of command, generated some internal discussion, and effectively disappeared into the institutional fog. This is one of the most consistently reported characteristics of UAP encounters within the American military, the absence of formal, documented follow-up. Pilots who report encounters frequently describe being informally discouraged from talking about it, not receiving any official investigation feedback, and watching the paperwork associated with their reports simply vanish into bureaucratic obscurity. This is not a conspiracy. It does not require a coordinated cover-up. It is the predictable result of institutions that have not built proper reporting and investigation structures for a category of phenomena that the official culture has spent decades treating as either non-existent or unimportant. When an organization has no formal protocol for handling a type of report, that report tends to disappear, not because someone burns it, simply because there is nowhere official for it to go. The absence of Air Force involvement after 2004 fits this pattern exactly. The Air Force had formally concluded, in 1969, that UAP were not a serious national security concern. They had closed their investigation program. They had issued their official conclusion. And within the Air Force's institutional culture, reopening that file, even in the face of extraordinary new evidence, would have required overcoming enormous internal resistance. Not because Air Force generals are stupid or cowardly, but because institutions are inherently conservative, because careers are built on alignment with established institutional positions, and because the cost of being associated with a topic that the official culture has marked as fringe is very high. To be the Air Force general who stands up and says we need to reopen the UAP investigation is to invite ridicule, career damage, and the label of someone who has gone off the deep end. The incentive structure in large bureaucratic organizations actively punishes the act of challenging deeply embedded official positions. The Navy, again, had less institutional baggage here. The Navy had no equivalent of Blue Book. The Navy had not issued an official public conclusion about UAP. The Navy's leadership could, when the political environment eventually shifted enough, acknowledge the Tic-Tac encounter and formalize new reporting procedures without reversing a decades-long public institutional position. They were not contradicting themselves in the way the Air Force would have to. Now let us talk about what was happening in the years between 2004 and 2017, because those 13 years are not empty. Things were moving, quietly, beneath the surface. In 2007, Senator Harry Reid of Nevada, working with Senators Ted Stevens of Alaska and Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, secured approximately $22 million in classified funding for what became the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. The program was run out of the Pentagon by Luis Elizondo and investigated UAP encounters with a level of institutional seriousness that had not existed since Project Blue Book, and arguably with more genuine rigor and openness than Blue Book had ever managed. What is notable about ADIP is not just what it investigated, but who championed it. Harry Reid was a Nevada senator, Nevada being home to Nellis Air Force Base, Area 51, the Nevada Test and Training Range, and a long tradition of extraordinary aircraft sightings associated with classified Air Force programs. Reid's interest in UAP was long-standing and genuine. Ted Stevens, before his death in 2010, had his own history with UAP. He had been a World War II combat pilot and had spoken privately about encounters he could not explain. These were not fringe politicians. These were senior members of the Senate's Defense Appropriations Infrastructure, and they directed funding toward a UAP investigation program that operated in classified space for 5 years before Elizondo resigned from the Pentagon in 2017 and helped bring the ADIP story public. The Air Force, despite being the branch of the military most historically associated with UAP investigation, and despite operating many of the facilities most relevant to advanced aerospace research, was not the institutional home of ADIP. The program was run through the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, not the Air Force, not the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force. The institutional center of gravity for serious UAP investigation within the American government in the 2007 to 2012 period was explicitly not the Air Force. And that is a remarkable fact that has not received nearly enough attention in public discussions of this topic. Why would you run a classified Pentagon UAP investigation program without making the Air Force its primary institutional partner? One possible answer is jurisdictional efficiency. The Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence has cross-service authority that no individual branch possesses, which may have made it a more practical administrative home. But another possible answer is more uncomfortable. Another possible answer is that by 2007, serious people within the defense and intelligence establishment had concluded that the Air Force could not be trusted to investigate UAP objectively, that its institutional investment in the post-Blue Book conclusion was too deep, its internal culture too resistant, and its leadership too committed to the established position to conduct a genuine, open-minded investigation. If you believe that UAP represented a real and potentially extraordinary security concern, and you wanted that concern investigated with genuine rigor, maybe you did not want the institution that had spent 40 years officially dismissing the subject running your investigation program. This is speculation, and it should be clearly labeled as such. The actual decision-making process behind ADIP's administrative structure has never been fully disclosed. But the pattern, Navy talking, intelligence community investigating, Air Force silent, is too consistent to be entirely coincidental. Something structural is happening here. Something institutional. And understanding what that structural something might be requires looking at the Air Force's historical relationship with UAP more carefully than most discussions of the Tic-Tac case ever do. Go back to Project Blue Book. Officially, Blue Book investigated over 12,000 UAP reports between 1952 and 1969. At the end of the program, the Air Force declared that approximately 700 of those reports remained unidentified, meaning the Air Force's own investigators, with access to classified information about military aircraft, weather programs, and intelligence operations, could not explain them. 700. That is not a small number. That is not a rounding error. That is a substantial body of documentation representing encounters that the Air Force's own people could not account for with any conventional explanation. And yet the Air Force's official conclusion was that none of this represented a national security threat. How do you look at 700 unexplained encounters involving airspace that the Air Force is responsible for defending and conclude that none of it represents a national security concern? That conclusion has puzzled researchers, historians, and physicists for decades. The Condon Committee, which produced the final report that accompanied Blue Book's closure, is a case study in institutional conclusions being reached before the investigation is complete. Dr. Edward Condon, the committee's chair, made public statements early in the committee's work that strongly suggested he had already reached his conclusion before reviewing the data. Other committee members, including Dr. David Saunders, later accused Condon of running a biased process. Saunders was fired from the committee after raising these concerns internally. The American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics issued a formal statement disagreeing with the Condon report's conclusions. The American Association for the Advancement of Science held a symposium in 1969 where multiple scientists challenged the report's methodology and findings. The Condon Report was, in other words, contested from the moment of its release by mainstream scientific institutions. And yet it served as the Air Force's official justification for shutting down UAP investigation for the next 5 decades. Why would an institution close an investigation program over contested findings? Why would an institution stake its official position on a report that was immediately and publicly challenged by credible scientific organizations? The most charitable answer is institutional fatigue. Blue Book had become a public relations burden, generating more controversy than clarity, and closing it was a way to stop the bleeding. The less charitable answer is that the conclusion served institutional interests. The Air Force's primary mission, as it was conceived in the Cold War period, was to deter and, if necessary, fight Soviet military power. Acknowledging that unknown aerial objects were penetrating American airspace with impunity, objects that the Air Force could not intercept, could not identify, and could not explain, was incompatible with the Air Force's core narrative of technological superiority and airspace mastery. The institutional incentive to reach a reassuring conclusion was enormous. And an institution that has made that choice once, in 1969, and built decades of policy on it is extremely unlikely to voluntarily reverse it. Now let us fast forward back to 2019, because 2019 is when something genuinely remarkable happened. In April of that year, the United States Navy officially acknowledged that the 3 videos, FLIR 1, Gimbal, and Go Fast, that had been circulating publicly since 2017 were genuine Navy recordings. The Navy had not previously officially confirmed or denied their authenticity. The confirmation was itself newsworthy, but far more significant than the confirmation was what came alongside it. The announcement that the Navy was formalizing new reporting guidelines for military personnel who encountered UAP. The Navy was, in effect, saying, "These encounters are real, they are documented, and we need a proper institutional mechanism for handling them. We are building one." The Air Force's response: silence. No parallel announcement. No acknowledgement of the FLIR videos. No formal statement about Air Force UAP encounters. No updated reporting guidelines. Nothing. In the same news cycle where the Navy was taking what amounted to an extraordinary institutional step, one of the most significant official acknowledgments of UAP reality by any military branch in American history, the Air Force had nothing to say. This silence became even more conspicuous in June 2021, when the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released its preliminary assessment on UAP, the report that Congress had mandated as part of the Intelligence Authorization Act. The report covered 144 UAP encounters reported by United States government sources between 2004 and 2021. 144 encounters officially documented. The report concluded that in all but one case, insufficient data existed to attribute the objects to any known source: United States technology, adversary technology, or natural phenomena. The implication, though the report was careful not to state it explicitly, was that something was operating in American military airspace that the entire United States intelligence and military establishment could not identify or explain. Where was the Air Force in this report's release? The report was, again, an intelligence community product rather than an Air Force product. The Air Force was not the institutional face of American UAP investigation. And while individual Air Force officials undoubtedly contributed classified information to the report's preparation, the Air Force as an institution was not the author, the champion, or the public face of this historic disclosure. That role fell to the newly established UAP Task Force, which had been stood up under the Department of the Navy in August 2020. Under the Department of the Navy, not the Department of the Air Force. Under the Navy. Let us talk about what the Air Force was doing during all of this time, because the Air Force was not simply sitting idle. The Air Force operates the most classified advanced aerospace programs in the world. Classified programs with names that the public never hears, with capabilities that are decades ahead of anything publicly acknowledged. The Lockheed Skunk Works, Boeing Phantom Works, Northrop Grumman's classified divisions. These are the organizations that build what the Air Force flies in secret. And some researchers, including serious ones like aviation journalist Tyler Rogaway of the War Zone, have argued that at least some of the UAP encounters reported by Navy pilots might be explainable as classified American programs that the Navy is not read into. That is, secret Air Force technology that even senior Navy commanders do not know about. This is a genuinely important possibility, and it deserves serious consideration. The United States has a long history of highly classified aviation programs that were mistaken for UFOs by people who genuinely did not know what they were seeing. The U-2, the State Route 71, stealth programs in development during the 1970s and 1980s. There is documented CIA and Air Force history of encouraging UFO reports to serve as cover for classified aviation activity. When ordinary civilians reported seeing strange lights or unusual objects in the Nevada desert in the 1950s and 1960s, the government's unofficial policy was sometimes to let them believe they had seen something extraterrestrial rather than reveal the existence of classified aircraft programs. This history is real, documented, and important. But there are serious problems with applying this explanation to the Tic-Tac specifically. The first and most fundamental problem is the performance envelope. Even the most optimistic assessments of classified American aviation technology struggle to account for the specific capabilities demonstrated by the Tic-Tac as described by trained observers. Instantaneous acceleration with no heat signature, hovering with no visible means of lift, transition from 80,000 feet to ocean surface level in less than a second. These are not capabilities that any known propulsion system, classified or otherwise, can explain. And serious aerospace engineers and physicists who have reviewed the Tic-Tac case, people with security clearances, people who understand what is at the edge of classified American capability, have said privately, and in some cases publicly, that what the witnesses described goes far beyond anything they are aware of in the American inventory. The second problem with the classified American program hypothesis is operational. Why would the Air Force test a program with those capabilities in the same airspace as Navy carrier training operations, without warning the Navy, potentially creating a catastrophic collision risk and generating exactly the kind of documented and potentially public record that a classified program would want to avoid? The answer that some classified program advocates give is that it was a test of the Navy's detection capabilities, essentially a red team exercise to see if the Navy's sensors could pick up the classified vehicle. But if so, why were data drives pulled and crew members informally warned to stay quiet? That response suggests something unexpected happened, not something planned. The third and perhaps most philosophically significant problem is that even if some percentage of UAP encounters are explainable as classified American programs, the Tic-Tac case has specific characteristics. The disturbed water at the ocean surface, the apparent awareness of the strike group's classified operational coordinates, the multi-day presence. That suggests something far more complex than a simple classified aviation test. Whatever was operating in that area in November 2004, it appeared to be operating in and around the ocean as much as in the air. The churning water directly below the hovering object is a detail that does not fit neatly into any conventional explanation, classified or otherwise. But let us assume, for the sake of completeness, that the classified American program hypothesis has genuine merit. If it does, if some of what the Navy has been encountering is in fact classified Air Force technology, then the Air Force's silence on the topic is not mysterious at all. It is entirely rational. You do not acknowledge the existence of a classified program by publicly responding to UAP sightings that might be attributed to that program. Your silence is not evasion. It is operational security. And in that reading, the Navy's public engagement with the UAP topic, the new reporting guidelines, the acknowledgement of the videos, the support for the UAP task force, might even serve the Air Force's interests because it directs public and congressional attention toward an extraterrestrial or unknown adversary explanation rather than toward the possibility of classified American technology. This is the deepest level at which the Navy-Air Force divergence on UAP becomes interesting from a strategic analysis perspective. Is the Navy's openness genuine, reflecting a real organizational reckoning with an unexplained phenomenon? Or is it, at least in part, institutionally convenient, providing public cover for classified capabilities while simultaneously generating bureaucratic and budgetary momentum toward UAP investigation programs that the national security establishment wants funded? Both things can be true simultaneously. Institutions are not monolithic. Different factions within the same institution can have entirely different motivations for supporting the same policy outcome. Some people within the Navy might be pushing for UAP transparency because they genuinely believe humanity is being visited by something extraordinary. Others might be supporting the same transparency because it generates funding for sensor systems and analytical capabilities that the Navy wants anyway. Others might be supporting it because they believe the objects are Chinese or Russian hypersonic technology and they want congressional authorization for countermeasure development. The public face of the Navy's UAP engagement, official acknowledgement, new reporting guidelines, support for the UAP task force, is the same regardless of which internal faction is driving it. Now let us consider what happened in the years after 2021, because the story has continued to develop and the institutional dynamics have continued to evolve. In 2022, Congress established the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, ARO, as the successor to the UAP task force, this time housed not under the Navy, but under the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security. ARO was given a broader mandate, cross-domain authority, and a directive to coordinate UAP investigation across all military branches, including the Air Force. This was, potentially, the moment when the Air Force's institutional exemption from UAP accountability might begin to erode. If ARO has genuine cross-service authority and congressional backing, the Air Force cannot simply maintain its default silence as easily as it could when the UAP task force was a Navy-housed organization. And indeed, there have been indications since 2022 that the Air Force has begun, carefully and with characteristic institutional caution, to engage more seriously with the UAP question. Individual Air Force officers have filed UAP reports through ARO. Air Force research laboratories have been mentioned in the context of ARO's analytical work. But the Air Force has still not done what the Navy did in 2019, issued a public institutional statement acknowledging UAP encounters as a genuine and serious matter worthy of formal investigation and transparent reporting. That step remains untaken. And until it is taken, the contrast between the Navy's relative openness and the Air Force's persistent institutional silence remains one of the most striking features of American military UAP policy. David Fravor, who has become perhaps the most publicly prominent military UAP witness in American history, has spoken extensively about this dynamic in interviews and in his congressional testimony. He has expressed frustration with the institutional barriers to honest UAP reporting. He has noted that the cultural pressure within military aviation to avoid being labeled as someone who sees things has historically suppressed reporting of genuine encounters. He has advocated for formal, anonymous reporting mechanisms that allow aviators to document extraordinary encounters without fear of career consequences. And he has done all of this while remaining, by his own description, agnostic about the ultimate nature of what he encountered. He does not claim to know whether what he saw was extraterrestrial, classified American technology, classified adversary technology, or something else entirely. He claims only that it was real, that it was extraordinary, and that it deserves honest investigation. That is a remarkably reasonable and scientifically appropriate position for someone in his situation to take. The Air Force, notably, has produced no equivalent public figure. No Air Force pilot who encountered something extraordinary has become a public advocate for UAP transparency with the institutional support, however informal, that Fravor has received. This absence is itself telling. It suggests either that Air Force aviators are not having comparable encounters, which would itself be remarkable given the Air Force's extensive flight operations, or that Air Force institutional culture continues to suppress reporting and public engagement with the topic to a degree that the Navy no longer does. As of the time this was written, the conversation about UAP in American government and military circles had reached a level of seriousness and institutional legitimacy that would have been almost unimaginable even 10 years ago. Congressional hearings on UAP have included testimony from former military and intelligence officials who made claims of extraordinary specificity, including former intelligence officer David Grush's 2023 testimony alleging the existence of a secret government program involving non-human intelligence and recovered non-human technology. Whether or not Grush's specific claims prove accurate, the fact that Congress invited him to testify under oath in a formal hearing represents a profound shift in institutional seriousness on this topic. And through all of it, through the congressional hearings, through the ARO reports, through the ongoing public debate, the Air Force has maintained a posture that can best be described as one of deliberate minimalism. They answer direct questions narrowly. They acknowledge participating in ARO's coordination mechanisms. They do not volunteer information. They do not offer their own institutional assessment. They do not produce their own equivalent of the Navy's 2019 UAP reporting guidelines announcement. They watch, they wait, and they stay silent in the particular, considered way that large, powerful institutions stay silent when silence serves their interests better than speech. What should we make of all of this? What is the honest, intellectually responsible takeaway from the story of the Tic-Tac encounter and the extraordinary institutional divergence between how the Navy and the Air Force have responded to it? The honest answer is that we do not know enough to be certain of anything. We do not know what David Fravor saw. We do not know whether it represents extraterrestrial technology, classified human technology, or something else that does not yet fit either of those categories. We do not know whether the Navy's relative openness reflects genuine institutional reckoning with an extraordinary phenomenon or is, at least in part, a strategic communication choice serving other interests. We do not know whether the Air Force's silence reflects operational security around classified programs, institutional inertia rooted in the Blue Book legacy, or something more deliberate and consequential. What we do know is this. Something happened in November 2004 off the coast of Southern California. Something that multiple trained military observers saw, that multiple radar systems tracked, that infrared sensors recorded, and that a brief but striking piece of video footage captured. Something that moved in ways that no known technology can explain. Something that appeared to be aware of the people observing it. Something that went directly to a classified tactical coordinate. And whatever it was, the institutional response to it, from the branch of the American military most historically associated with investigating this type of phenomenon, was silence. Decades of it. Ongoing today. That silence is itself a kind of data. In military and intelligence analysis, The absence of an expected response is never simply neutral. It always means something. When the nation's premier air power service watches one of the most extraordinary documented UAP encounters in military history unfold, watches its Navy counterparts eventually acknowledge and formally respond to that encounter, and chooses to say nothing, that choice has a logic. We may not fully understand that logic. We may never be permitted to fully understand it. But it is there, and it matters. The Tic-Tac case is ultimately not just a story about a mysterious object over the Pacific. It is a story about the nature of institutional knowledge, institutional secrecy, and the extraordinary difficulty of getting large, powerful, culturally conservative organizations to honestly confront phenomena that challenge their established positions. It is a story about the cost that individual service members pay when they report things that the official culture does not want reported. It is a story about the difference between what governments know and what governments say. And it is a story that is still being told, still unfolding, still, in its most important dimensions, unresolved. Commander David Fravor saw something on November 14, 2004, that changed his understanding of what is possible in the sky above our world. He reported it honestly, at professional risk to himself, because he believed that honest reporting was part of his duty as a military officer. The system he reported it to swallowed his report, took the data, and returned silence. And that silence has now lasted more than 2 decades. 2 decades in which the technology we saw in that video has not been matched by anything publicly acknowledged as human-built. 2 decades in which the questions have only grown larger while the official answers have remained as thin and incomplete as ever. Whatever the Tic-Tac was, wherever it came from, whoever or whatever built it, the most unsettling thing about the story may not be the object itself. It may be the fact that the most powerful military in the history of civilization looked at it, tracked it, filmed it, and then chose, institutionally, not to talk about it. And it may be the fact that the branch of that military most responsible for understanding and defending American airspace, the branch that spent 20 years officially investigating this exact category of phenomenon, looked at all of that evidence and had absolutely nothing to say. The sky has secrets. The question is, who is keeping them and why?